It started with a whisper, being here, so quiet, listening. I almost didn't hear it. If this story touched you, I was sitting at the kitchen table that afternoon. It helps more than you know. The same place I had sat for nearly 30 years. If you'd like to hear more stories, the sunlight falling, and if you feel come through the window, above leave the sink, a comment telling me smelled faintly where you're listening from, and the apple or sharing a small part earlier of your own story. Across from me, my son Daniel was arranging several sheets of paper into a neat stack. "Just a few things to sign, Mom," he said casually. He had said those words many times before. After my husband passed away 2 years ago, Daniel began helping me with paperwork, bank forms, insurance letters, things that seemed to grow more confusing with every passing year. "You shouldn't have to deal with all this," he always told me. And I believed him, because he was my son. He pointed to the bottom of the first page. "Just sign here," he said with a smile. I adjusted my glasses and picked up the pen. That's when I felt a small hand tug gently at my sleeve. "Grandma." I turned my head. My grandson Ethan was standing beside my chair. He was only 8 years old, small for his age, with the same dark eyes Daniel had when he was a boy. "What is it, sweetheart?" I asked softly. Instead of answering, Ethan glanced toward his father. Daniel was looking down at the papers, tapping the page with his finger. "Go play in the living room, Ethan," he said. But Ethan didn't move. He leaned closer to me, so close I could feel his breath near my ear. And then he whispered something so quietly that no one else in the room could possibly hear it. "Grandma," his voice trembled slightly. "Don't sign anything Dad gives you." The words sent a sudden chill through my chest. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. I turned toward him again. "What did you say?" But Ethan quickly straightened up, his face suddenly blank. Daniel looked up from the table. "What's going on?" he asked. "Nothing," Ethan said quickly. He turned and walked back toward the living room. The small sound of the television turning on filled the house. Daniel smiled at me again. "Kids," he said with a small laugh. Then he slid the paper closer. "Go ahead, Mom," he said gently. "Just sign right there." My hand hovered over the paper. But now, the pen suddenly felt heavier than it had a moment ago, because Ethan's whisper kept echoing in my mind. "Don't sign anything Dad gives you." And suddenly, I wasn't so sure I should. For a moment, my hand stayed frozen above the paper. Daniel noticed. "Everything all right, Mom?" he asked. "Yes," I said slowly. But the truth was, something inside me had shifted the moment Ethan whispered those words. "Don't sign anything Dad gives you." Children say strange things sometimes. They misunderstand conversations. They imagine problems that aren't really there. But the way Ethan had looked at me, that hadn't been imagination. That had been worry. I set the pen down gently. "Daniel," I said, adjusting my glasses, "what exactly are these papers again?" He smiled the same calm smile he had used earlier. "Just some account updates." "Account updates," I repeated. "Yes," he said. "Some things the bank recommended." He slid the top page closer to me. I glanced down at it. The page was full of small legal print, the kind that makes your eyes feel tired before you even finish the first sentence. Daniel tapped the bottom of the paper again. "You don't need to read all of it," he said reassuringly. "Just sign where the line is." His voice was patient. But something about that sentence made my chest tighten, because Daniel had always been a careful man. When he bought his own house years ago, he spent 3 weeks reading every line of the contract before signing anything, and yet now, he didn't want me to read a single page. I looked down again. The words on the document blurred slightly as my thoughts drifted back to Ethan. His small voice, the way he had leaned close to me, the fear in his whisper. Across the table, Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, yes, you've been staring at that page for a while." I looked up. He was watching me carefully now, not impatient, but alert. "I just want to understand what I'm signing," I said gently. Daniel chuckled softly. "You trust me, don't you?" Trust. That word has a strange power. It makes you feel guilty for asking questions. And Daniel knew that. Of course, I trusted him. He was my son. But trust does not mean blindness. "Of course I trust you," I said calmly. "But I'd still like to read it." Daniel hesitated, only for a second, but I noticed he leaned back slightly in his chair. "Well," he said, "it's really just technical language." "I'm not in a hurry," I replied. The room grew quiet. In the living room, the television continued playing softly. Ethan's cartoon voices drifted faintly down the hallway. Daniel tapped his fingers lightly on the table. Finally, he spoke again. "Mom, it's nothing complicated." "Then it shouldn't take long to read," I said. Another pause, and then something small happened that made my stomach tighten. Daniel reached forward and gently placed his hand over the top half of the document, covering most of the page, leaving only the signature line visible. "Really," he said with a smile, "just sign here." But now, I was beginning to understand why my grandson had been so worried. For a moment, I simply looked at Daniel's hand resting on the paper. He had placed it there so naturally, so casually, that someone else might not have noticed. But I did. Most of the page was now covered by his palm. Only the bottom section remained visible, the blank line waiting for my signature. "Daniel," I said gently. "Yes, Mom. Would you mind moving your hand?" He looked down, as if suddenly realizing what he had done. "Oh," he said quickly, lifting it. "Sorry about that." But the moment his hand moved, I leaned forward and adjusted my glasses. And finally, I began to read. The words at the top of the document were written in bold letters. "Authorization agreement." I felt my chest tighten slightly. Authorization for what? My eyes moved down the page. The language was long and formal, filled with terms that seemed intentionally complicated, but one sentence stood out clearly: granting temporary control of financial and property decisions. Property decisions. I read the sentence again, and then I noticed the name written further down the page. Authorized representative, Daniel Carter, my son. The room suddenly felt a little colder. Across the table, Daniel was watching me carefully. "You don't have to read all that," he said again. "It's just standard wording." Standard. The word sounded harmless, but Ethan's whisper echoed loudly in my mind. "Don't sign anything Dad gives you." I continued reading. The next paragraph explained something even more troubling. If the agreement was signed, Daniel would gain authority to manage my finances and property decisions. Temporarily, the document said, But temporary things have a way of becoming permanent, especially when paperwork is involved. I slowly lowered the paper and looked at my son. Daniel, I said softly, yes, this says you would control my property decisions. He nodded quickly. Only if something happens. What kind of something? You know, he said with a small shrug. If you start having trouble remembering things, remembering the word again. It had appeared more and more often in his conversations with me lately. You've been forgetting things, Mom, he said gently. We talked about this. I studied his face carefully. He looked calm, confident, like someone who believed everything was perfectly reasonable. But now, a different question had begun forming in my mind. A question I hadn't considered before. If this agreement gave Daniel control over my property, what exactly did he plan to do with that control? The kitchen felt very quiet. Finally, Daniel slid the pen back toward me. Just sign it, he said softly. But this time, I didn't pick it up, because now I understood something that made Ethan's whisper feel far more important than I first realized. My grandson hadn't been imagining things. He had been trying to warn me. The pen rested on the table between us. Daniel pushed it a little closer. Go ahead, Mom, he said gently. It's just a precaution. Precaution. The words sounded harmless, almost comforting. But something about it made my chest feel tight. I looked down at the paper again. Temporary control of financial and property decisions. Temporary. Until when? The document didn't say. Across from me, Daniel was watching my face carefully now. Not impatient, but alert, like someone waiting for a decision. In the living room, Ethan's cartoon played softly in the background. The bright, cheerful voices felt strangely out of place. Daniel, I said quietly. Yes. What exactly happens after I sign this? He smiled, the same reassuring smile he had used many times before. Nothing changes, he said. It just gives me permission to help if you need it. Help? You already help me, I replied. Yes, he said, but this makes it official. Official. That word carried weight. I studied his expression. He looked relaxed, but his fingers were tapping lightly against the table. A small, nervous rhythm. You mentioned memory earlier, I said. Daniel nodded. You've been forgetting things lately. What things? He paused. Well, your glasses sometimes. That happens to everyone. And you asked me the same question twice last week. That also happens to everyone. Daniel sighed slightly. Mom, I'm not saying anything is wrong. But you're preparing for it, I said. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he nodded. Yes. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. When did you start thinking I couldn't take care of myself? Daniel looked surprised. That's not what I said. But that's what this paper means, I replied softly. The room grew quiet. For the first time since we sat down, Daniel's confidence seemed to fade slightly. He picked up the pen and rolled it between his fingers. Mom, you know I only want what's best for you. I believed that. At least part of it, but the paper in front of me told a different story. Did you show this to Ethan? I asked suddenly. Daniel frowned. Why would I do that? I shrugged gently. He seemed worried. Daniel laughed. He's 8. Children notice things, I said. Daniel waved his hand dismissively. Mom, you're overthinking this. Maybe. But Ethan's whisper still echoed in my mind. Don't sign anything Dad gives you. I looked down at the document again, then back at my son. Daniel, I said slowly. Yes. What would happen if I didn't sign this? For the first time that afternoon, Daniel didn't smile. Daniel didn't answer immediately. The kitchen suddenly felt very quiet, as if even the house itself was waiting for his response. He stared at the paper for a moment, rolling the pen slowly between his fingers. Then he sighed. Mom, he said carefully, there's really no reason not to sign it. That wasn't an answer. What happens if I don't? I asked again. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Well, things just get more complicated. Complicated. The words sounded vague, almost harmless. But the way he said it made my stomach tighten. How complicated? I asked. Daniel hesitated. Then he rubbed his forehead slowly. It just makes it harder for me to help you if something happens. Something happens. He kept repeating those words, but he never explained what that something actually was. I studied his face carefully. Daniel, I said softly, are you planning to do something with this house? His eyes flickered for a moment. Just a small movement. But I noticed. Of course not, he said quickly. Then why does this document mention property decisions? Daniel shifted in his seat. It's just standard language. Standard. Another harmless word. But now, harmless words were starting to feel dangerous. In the living room, Ethan laughed at something on the television. The sound floated into the kitchen like a small reminder that not everyone in this house was playing the same game. Daniel pushed the pen toward me again. Mom, you're worrying too much. I didn't touch it. Daniel, I said gently, why did Ethan tell me not to sign anything? That question landed harder than any of the others. Daniel froze. For a moment, his expression went completely still. Then he forced a small laugh. Kids say strange things. Maybe. I leaned forward slightly, but he sounded scared. Daniel's smile faded. He shouldn't have said anything to you. The words slipped out before he could stop them. I felt my chest tighten. Anything, I repeated. Daniel realized what he had just said. He quickly looked toward the living room. Then, Mom, you're misunderstanding. But now something was clear. Ethan hadn't just been guessing. He had heard something. Something that frightened him enough to whisper that warning in my ear. The kitchen suddenly felt colder, because if my grandson was afraid of what his father was doing, then maybe I should be too. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Daniel was still looking toward the living room, where the television flickered softly with bright cartoon colors. Ethan's small laughter drifted into the kitchen again, innocent and unaware of the tension filling the room. I followed Daniel's gaze. Maybe we should ask him, I said quietly. Daniel turned back toward me quickly. There's no reason to involve Ethan. Why not? He's a child, Daniel replied sharply. He doesn't understand these things. Perhaps he was right, but children understand fear, and Ethan had been afraid. I stood up slowly from my chair. Mom, Daniel said, rising as well. Yes, let's just finish the paperwork. But I had already begun walking toward the living room. Ethan was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, his eyes fixed on the television. A bowl of crackers rested beside him on the coffee table. When he saw me, his face brightened immediately. "Grandma," I smiled gently and sat beside him. "Can I ask you something, sweetheart?" He nodded. Daniel stepped into the doorway behind us. "Ethan," he said quickly, "why don't you go play in your room for a while?" But Ethan didn't move. I placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Earlier," I said softly, "you told me not to sign anything your dad gives me." Ethan's smile faded. He looked down at the carpet. "Why did you say that?" I asked. For a moment, he didn't answer. Daniel cleared his throat behind us. "Mom, really?" But Ethan spoke before his father could finish. "Because Dad said something." The room fell quiet. I kept my voice calm. "What did he say?" Ethan hesitated. Then he glanced nervously toward the kitchen. "Yesterday," he whispered. "Yesterday," I repeated. He nodded. "I heard Dad talking on the phone." My heart began beating faster. "What did he say?" Ethan looked at his hands. "He said, after you sign the papers, everything will belong to him." The words hung in the air like a sudden storm. Behind me, Daniel stepped forward quickly. "Ethan, that's not what I said." But Ethan shook his head. "Yes, it is," he insisted quietly. "You said the house would be yours once Grandma signs." My chest tightened. "The house." Daniel's voice became tense. "You misunderstood the conversation." But Ethan's eyes were filled with the simple certainty only children have. "I didn't misunderstand," he said. The living room felt suddenly smaller. Because now, the warning my grandson whispered to me made perfect sense. The room went completely silent. Ethan sat beside me on the carpet, his small hands resting in his lap. Daniel stood near the doorway, his face tense, his shoulders stiff. No one moved. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Ethan misunderstood the conversation," he said firmly, but his voice no longer sounded calm. It sounded defensive. I slowly stood up and turned toward my son. "Did you say that?" I asked. Daniel shook his head quickly. "Mom, you can't take an 8-year-old's memory as proof of anything." Proof. The word echoed in my mind. "I'm not asking for proof," I said quietly. "I'm asking for the truth." Daniel looked frustrated now. "You're twisting things," he said. "Am I?" I walked back into the kitchen and picked up the stack of papers from the table. The document felt heavier than it had earlier. I turned the first page slowly. "Temporary control of financial and property decisions," I read aloud. Daniel crossed his arms. "Yes, and you're the authorized representative. That's what the document says." I looked up at him. "What happens after I sign this?" Daniel sighed. "Mom, we already talked about this." "No," I replied gently. "You talked around it." The room grew quiet again. In the living room, Ethan had muted the television. He was watching us carefully. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "This is just planning ahead," he said. "Planning for what?" "For when you can't manage things anymore." The words stung, even though he tried to say them kindly. "And when exactly will that be?" I asked. Daniel looked uncomfortable. "I don't know." "So this paper gives you control of the house until that happens?" "Yes." "And what happens after that?" I asked. Daniel didn't answer. That silence told me more than any words could. "You plan to sell it," I said softly. Daniel looked up sharply. "No." But his hesitation had already revealed enough. You told someone on the phone that everything would belong to you after I sign, I continued. Ethan's small voice spoke again from the living room. That's what I heard. Daniel turned toward him. Ethan, go to your room. But Ethan didn't move. He looked at me instead. Because children know when something important is happening. I placed the document back on the table. Then I slid the pen across the surface toward Daniel. I'm not signing this, I said calmly. Daniel stared at me. For the first time that afternoon, he realized his plan was falling apart. For a moment, Daniel just stared at the pen on the table. The room felt heavy with silence. Even Ethan stayed perfectly still in the living room, watching us from the edge of the couch. You're making a mistake, Mom, Daniel said finally. No, I replied gently. I'm making a choice. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing slowly across the kitchen floor, the way he used to do when he was trying to solve a difficult problem. You don't understand how complicated things can get, he said. Then explain them to me. He stopped walking. His eyes moved around the kitchen, the old cabinets, the window above the sink, the worn wooden table where we were standing. This house is too much for you now, he said quietly. Too much. The words felt familiar. People had started saying things like that to me lately. You shouldn't live here alone. You need something easier. You need help. But none of those words meant what they sounded like. They meant something else. They meant someone else wanted to decide for me. I've lived here for 37 years, I said. That was before, Daniel replied. Before what? He hesitated. Before things started changing. I studied his face carefully. What things? Daniel exhaled slowly. You forget things sometimes. I smiled faintly. So do you. He didn't smile back. This house could be worth a lot of money, he continued. There it was, the sentence that had been hiding behind all the others. Worth, money. Suddenly, everything made sense. You want to sell it, I said. Daniel looked frustrated. I want to protect you. By selling my home. By moving you somewhere safer, he insisted. Where? A retirement community. I nodded slowly. And after the house is sold, Daniel didn't answer right away. Finally, he spoke. The money would be managed. By you. He didn't deny it. The truth had finally stepped into the room. Not anger, not cruelty, just a plan. A plan Daniel believed was reasonable. But a plan that began by taking something from me, the choice. Ethan stood quietly in the doorway now. He looked between us, his small face worried. I turned toward him and smiled softly. It's all right, I said. Then I looked back at Daniel. You should have talked to me, I said gently. Daniel's voice softened for the first time. I didn't think you'd say yes. And he was right, because deep down, he had always known I wouldn't. Daniel stood in the middle of the kitchen, looking suddenly unsure of himself. For the first time since he arrived that afternoon, he didn't seem confident anymore. He looked tired, almost like someone who had been carrying a plan in his head for too long and was only now realizing it might not work. I was trying to do the right thing, he said quietly. I believed that part. Fear can make people believe they're protecting someone when they're actually taking something away from them. But good intentions don't erase the truth. You were trying to decide my future for me, I said. Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he looked around the kitchen again. His eyes moved across the walls where old photographs hung, the one of him graduating high school, another of him holding Ethan when he was a baby. Memories lived in this house. Not just mine, his too. You shouldn't have to worry about all this, he said softly. I don't, I replied. You could have someone looking after you. I already do. Daniel frowned slightly. Who? I placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder as he stood beside me. My family, I said. Ethan smiled faintly. Daniel looked down at the table where the papers still rested. The document that would have given him control, the document I had refused to sign. You're going to regret this someday, he said quietly. Maybe. I picked up the stack of papers and folded them neatly. But it won't be because I let someone else decide where I belong. The room was quiet again. Finally, Daniel nodded slowly. He reached for the papers. Can I take these? He asked. No, he looked surprised. I think I'll keep them, I said gently. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then stepped back. He walked toward the door slowly, as if the house felt different to him now. Maybe it did. At the door, he paused. I still worry about you, he said. I know. And I still think you need help. That may be true someday. I smiled softly, but today isn't that day. Daniel nodded. Then he opened the door and stepped outside. The evening sunlight filled the kitchen as the door closed behind him. For a moment, I simply stood there with Ethan beside me. Then I looked down at him. Thank you, I said. For what? He asked. For warning me. Ethan shrugged in the simple way children do. I just didn't want you to be tricked. His honesty made me laugh softly, because sometimes the clearest voice in a complicated situation is the smallest one. After Daniel left, the house grew quiet again. The kind of quiet that feels peaceful instead of heavy. I sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the papers one more time. The document that would have given my son control over my home was still lying there, the pen resting beside it, exactly where Daniel had placed it earlier. Ethan climbed back onto the couch and turned the television volume down low. The sun was beginning to set outside the kitchen window, casting long golden shadows across the floor. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan looked over at me. Grandma. Yes, sweetheart. Are you mad at Dad? Children ask questions adults are often afraid to say out loud. I thought about it carefully. No, I said, not mad. Ethan tilted his head. Then what? I smiled gently. Just a little sad. Why? Because sometimes people think they're helping when they're really taking something away. Ethan considered that quietly. The house, he asked. Yes, I said softly. This house held more than furniture and walls. It held birthdays, Christmas mornings, the sound of Daniel's footsteps running down the hallway when he was a boy. Homes carry pieces of the people who lived in them. You can't replace that with paperwork. Ethan slid off the couch and walked back into the kitchen. He climbed onto the chair beside me and looked at the papers. Are you going to sign it now? He asked. I shook my head. No. Good, he said immediately. His answer made me laugh softly. You're very sure about that. Dad sounded sneaky when he was on the phone, Ethan admitted. Children don't always understand adult plans, but they understand when something feels wrong. I folded the papers slowly and placed them into the kitchen drawer. That was where they would stay, unsigned, unfinished, a reminder of something important. I looked at Ethan again. You know, I said, today you protected your grandma. Ethan's eyes widened. I did, yes. How? By telling the truth. He smiled proudly. And in that moment, I realized something that made the whole day feel a little lighter. Sometimes we think wisdom only comes with age. But sometimes, the person who saves you is the smallest one in the room. And sometimes the quietest voice is the one you should listen